Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Koldar here. Today, we're doing a follow-up or addendum to the Heroic Amber Shaper Unsock guide in Heart of Fear, and this is a guide to assist with the tanking perspective of this encounter. That said, I won't cover much of the normal strategy and all that, so if you haven't seen it already, I would suggest you check out the normal Heroic guide that we did for this fight. As this will just focus on tanking aspects for any strategy that relies heavily on keeping Destabilize stacks on Amber Shaper and the Monstrosity throughout Phase 2. So you'll see that perspective here. So let's get started. Now I should mention up front that in this footage we are using a new strategy that we decided to try out, and it actually works pretty well, which is similar to our previous guide strategy, except we are using 3 tanks in this method. And I'll talk more in detail about this strategy later on, but suffice to say this seems a lot more stable, and I think is now our preferred method for doing this fight. So just keep that in mind. Now that said, just like with the other footage, the basic strategy here in Phase 1 is to get proper timing of your transition going into Phase 2 so you can have the appropriate tank as your permanent construct while also maintaining a number of living ambers needed to sustain that tank throughout the phase. So the number of ambers that we found to work best was 11 that are saved up. Now, the actual transition timing and how you handle the first phase will vary depending on whether all of your tanks are capable of being that permanent construct player or not. So there are basically 2 possible scenarios here, and we'll go over both of those really quick. So in this first scenario, we basically are assuming that one tank is a valid permanent construct for sustaining Destabilize during Phase 2, but your other tank, for whatever reason, is not able to sustain those stacks, and therefore is not a valid permanent construct target. So for this explanation, we'll refer to the intended tank construct player as the con tank, and the other player as the off tank. So there are 2 possible casts for Reshape Life that will determine how you handle the first phase somewhat. So if Reshape Life number 1 is cast on the con tank, then immediately all DPS should halt on Amber Shaper Unsock, which will likely stop his health around 95% or so. From this point forward, there should be no damage on Unsock except for Amber Strike from the current construct, as well as the Smash, which is auto attack damage from that player as well. To lower overall DPS on Unsock, the tank should get in the habit of facing Unsock when using Amber Strike every 6 seconds, but during the Amber Strike cooldown, to actually turn and face away from the boss, which will prevent unnecessary smash auto attack damage for about 5 out of every 6 seconds. Now with the first Reshape Life cast on the con tank, the raid should plan to have enough living amber and the boss health just above 70% shortly following the 5th cast of Reshape Life. Since the first Reshape Life was on the con tank, the 5th cast is the earliest possible moment when the number of living ambers will meet the goal of 11 saved, while also allowing Amber Shaper's health to be low enough to push the transition. Now to accomplish this timing goal, you can follow these simple steps. So first, DPS halts on Unsock once Reshape Life is cast and is seen to be targeting the con tank. During Reshape Life number 1, the con tank consumes all 4 pools, while DPS focus on the construct, and allow the con tank to exit the construct near the end of a scalpel cast, whenever it's convenient. During Reshape number 2, the off tank consumes 3 pools, leaving 1 behind on purpose, and again exits near the end of the scalpel. During Reshape number 3, the con tank consumes 1 pool only, saving another 3 amber and bringing the total to 4. During Reshape number 4, again the off tank consumes 1 pool only, saving another 3 and now the total saved is up to 7. And then finally, around 5 to 15 seconds after Reshape Life number 5 is cast on the con tank, the DPS can resume attacking Untitled, who should be around 75% or so at this time, and transition him into Phase 2 while ignoring the con tank's construct. The scalpel that precedes this final number 5 reshape will create the final 4 saved living amber, putting the total savings at the magical 11. Now, it's worth briefly noting that to sustain a current Destabilize stack on a single target, it is necessary for any constructed player to consume a minimum of 1 pool while below 80 energy. However, the timing can be tricky and should be thought about ahead of time for tanks during Phase 1. When consuming only 1 pool, a tank should spam Amber Strike like normal. However, once Amber Scalpel begins to cast, the tank should look to use 1 final Amber Strike to refresh the duration to 15 seconds. This Amber Strike should ideally be used around halfway through Amber Scalpel, so with about 5 seconds remaining on the cast. So as seen here, I've consumed 1 pool already, and I'm spamming Amber Strike as normal. But as soon as Amber Scalpel starts to cast, I prepare and use 1 final Amber Strike during the cast near the halfway mark, around 4.5 seconds in this case, and then I immediately exit the construct. This provides a nice 5 to 6 second window for the stack to be refreshed by the following constructed tank. And this extends the duration of Destabilize, and then the follow-up construct can continue as normal. So the other possibility when you're using only 1 valid construct tank is if Reshape Life number 1 is cast on the Offtank first. In this situation, DPS can generally continue on Amber Shaper throughout the phase, as the planned transition into Phase 2 will occur following Reshape number 4. The basic step-by-step is much the same as when Reshape number 1 is cast on the con tank, but of course it just starts at 1 Reshape cast later than that strategy. So during Reshape number 1, the Offtank consumes 3 pools only, leaving 1 behind. During Reshape number 2, the con tank consumes 1 pool, leaving 3 extra for a total savings of 4. Reshape number 3, again the Offtank consumes 1 pool only, saving another 3 for a total of 7. And then finally, 5 to 15 seconds after Reshape number 4, which is cast on the con tank, the DPS resume attacking Untitled if needed, and transition him into Phase 2. This will put the total saved ambers from the previous scalpel as well to the 11 mark once again. So everything else is the same as before, so just watch your DPS carefully to ensure that Untitled will not be approaching 70% too soon prior to that 5 or 15 second mark into Reshape number 4. So the final scenario is if all of your tanks are valid tank construct players. They can all perform the role equally well, so you don't have to force the construct or transition on any particular player. So of course this is the simplest way, and it basically mimics the single valid construct tank method where Reshape Life number 1 is cast on the Offtank, because in this case everyone is a valid Offtank since everyone is a valid con tank, and so it doesn't matter who gets targeted first. So if everyone can be the con tank, then you just have the first Reshape Life player consume 3 pools again. The second Reshape Life consume 1 pool. The third consume 1 pool. And then the fourth player is ignored, and you transition shortly after that 4th Reshape Life cast, with that 4th construct target being the valid full-time construct. And you'll have your 11 amber saved, and you can go on with your bad self. Now, to get into the Phase 2 Destabilize Juggling, the first thing you'll want to do is prepare your UI. Since the ultimate goal here is for the construct player to maintain Destabilize on both bosses, this player should do everything he or she can to plan ahead and make this as simple as possible. So first, remove unnecessary UI clutter. Now, many people often run 1 or more boss mods, which by default provide a lot of information. often this information is overwhelming and actually hinders the player. So especially in this scenario as the construct tank, such add-ons should be customized to suit the needs of the player and eliminate anything that can be distracting or misinform that player. In my case, I enable only one boss mod for this fight, and I turn off all warnings except for the key things I want to know about. First is my own Amber Explosion from my construct, the cooldown of that. Second is the approximate cooldown of the next grab or fling combo, since this will affect where the bosses are positioned. And then finally, for raid leader reasons only, the next cast of Reshape life, although most people could get rid of that as well. Additionally, it's useful to zoom your camera out a fair distance so you can see a good view of the battlefield for positions of the pools and the bosses, as well as remove the nameplates so you can get rid of some of the clutter that those provide. Now the second step is to add or improve the vital UI elements to assist in the construct stuff. So in this case, you want to know about 4 basic things at all times. First, when you are casting Amber Explosion and thus should interrupt yourself with struggle for control. Second, what your current willpower is at, and therefore when you're below 80 and can consume a pool safely. Third, what the Destabilize duration is on Amber, Shaper, Untitled. And fourth, of course, what the Destabilize is on the monstrosity. Now for readability, it's best to cluster this information together as much as you can. So if you look at my frame there, you can see I have above my unit frame my willpower and the Destabilize durations for both the bosses. I also have a very pronounced warning to make certain I know when I'm casting Amber Explosion. There you can see it there. It's a huge red bar that says interrupt. And this will only occur when I am casting, and I'll include the weak course for that in the description along with other stuff. So, the third thing you want to do is to allow simple targeting between the 2 bosses. This can be accomplished in a variety of ways, from making macros to target the bosses, to using the boss unit frames to click in and target them, to making macros that actually cast your Amber Strike at the appropriate target, as long as you're in range. So in my case, I created 2 simple target macros to uniquely target either the Amber Shaper or the monstrosity, and bound those to easy to press key combinations. In my case, Shift 1 and Shift 2 respectively. I then tied that information into my UI displays, as mentioned above, to remind myself, if needed, what the hotkey was. So my timers that display the Destabilize duration above my target frame are color-coded to differentiate between the 2 bosses a little bit. And the text also includes S1 and S2 to remind me that S1 or Shift 1 is for Amber Shaper targeting, and S2 or Shift 2 is for the monstrosity. And this makes it very easy to glance at those, whichever bar is the lowest at the time, in case I forget which target is next in the rotation, and know which hotkey I need to use to target and cast on next. Now, once you're fully prepared to engage the fight and handle Phase 2, the process of actually juggling Destabilize between both bosses is not all that difficult. I manage it by always keeping a few basic rules in mind. So first, keep energy as high as possible at all times. If your raid properly saved 11 living Amber going into Phase 2, as long as the construct tank sustains Destabilize stacks on the monstrosity throughout the phase, DPS will be plenty high enough to get through Phase 2 before the living Amber energy reserves run out. Now, to ensure energy never becomes an issue, as the construct tank, it's best to always keep your energy as high as possible without ever consuming a pool when energy is above 80 and therefore wasting it. This is best accomplished by consuming a pool very frequently, ideally after every 1 to 2 Amber Strike casts, anytime you're below 80 energy. You'll notice here that I never allow my energy to drop below 50 throughout all of Phase 2, just by keeping this rule in mind at all times. Now this provides an emergency reserve of energy in the event that a pool isn't within reach in that 6-second cooldown that occurs between Amber Strike casts, without worry that energy will run dangerously low. In such cases, the construct can simply remain near the bosses for Amber Strike use until the next cast of Amber Strike is to follow, and a pool is in a better position at that point. Maintaining high energy reserves for the emergency stockpile also ensures the construct will survive long enough should an amber pool not exist for a brief period while DPS are trying to kill new or freshly respawned living ambers. The second rule to keep in mind is to predict the boss's movement. This is primarily about watching the timing of grab and fling, as well as communicating with the rest of the raid when these events are due to occur. When fling is happening, watch the area around you to see which direction the flung player is being thrown to, and preemptively move that direction so your Amber Strike is not delayed, if at all possible. Construct travel distance issues can also be largely alleviated by ensuring that the raid maintains a fairly tight position throughout Phase 2. The Offtank, or Offtanks, that handle the bosses should try to stay as centered as possible at all times, while the raid members should stay within the central indentation area below the stairs to keep amber pools easily accessible. The third rule is to target the next Amber Strike target sooner rather than later. So this is just a good practice to get in the habit of, but the basic idea is simple. Find a pattern that is easily repeatable that forces you, as the construct, to cast the next Amber Strike on the appropriate target every time. So for me, this meant that as soon as I cast Amber Strike, I immediately used my opposite target macro to target the other boss as I moved around to consume pools and get in position. So this makes it easy to spam Amber Strike as soon as the cooldown is ending without worry about whether the target is correct. By having the next target pre-selected as soon as possible, it allows the actual target frame to also serve as a reminder about which boss is next, and therefore which needs to be in melee range for the upcoming Amber Strike. And then finally, the fourth rule is to plan your pool consumption path ahead of time. So at any given moment, but especially as Amber Strike is coming off cooldown and is about to be cast again, the construct player should be looking around at which pools are within reach and are convenient to consume next. If energy is low enough to do so, planning a path to consume 2 or more pools during a single 6-second Amber Strike cooldown period is even better and highly efficient. So with all the tactics and tips out of the way, let's go ahead and go through just a final walkthrough of the fight from the tank perspective. I'll just talk a little bit about what I'm doing and what the raid is doing at any given moment. So I pull the boss here, but because we were using 3 tanks, as I mentioned before, the actual Reshape cast order is fairly random. If you're using 2 tanks, however, generally speaking, the second tank, the one that's lower on threat when the first Reshape is cast, will most often be the first Reshape target. So you can somewhat force the cast order by doing that. But with 3 tanks, it's fairly random, so it doesn't really matter much. But anyway, we pull them to the center of the room so that we just get in position quickly and we can get the pools near the middle. We want to always keep the raid within this indentation as mentioned. And so our first tank that's Reshape is just going to town, stacking up as much as possible. And DPS are not halting on the boss since we can have any of our tanks be the valid construct for Phase 2. So we're just planning for that 4th Reshape target to be the permanent construct tank. So the first cast, that first player consumed 3 pools. Second one is on me here. So once I get below 80, I go and consume a pool and back on the boss. And as with anything, just to maximize your damage, make sure you are consuming between cooldowns of Amber Strike. And then make sure your DPS are watching health closely on the construct, because you can easily burn that player down, especially since they take 100% extra damage for 5 seconds after a struggle. So there I refresh the Destabilize stack about midway through Scalpel, and then got out quickly. And one thing to keep in mind is, for everybody, not just tank constructs, but anyone that's constructed, If you are casting Amber Explosion from the construct, you cannot use Amber Strike. You basically are channeling a cast time at that, a cast ability at that time. So you can't use any other abilities except for Struggle for Control. So if you're casting Amber Explosion, you have to interrupt that first by hitting number 2, and then you can do other things. So it's just a good idea to keep that in mind. This means that for non-tank players in Phase 2 that are constructs and must interrupt the Amber Explosion from the monstrosity, if the Amber Explosion from the monstrosity and the explosion from the constructed player are occurring at the same time, you have to use Struggle for Control to interrupt yourself first, and then Amber Strike on the monstrosity to interrupt him second. You cannot do it the other way around. So, as I said, for 3 cast, we wait about 5 to 15 seconds, and then push the boss over the transition. The timing for this, as I talked about in the first guide, is based on the energy level of the construct player, and therefore when the next Reshape cast is going to happen. You need that Reshape to occur at an appropriate time so that that Reshape player can interrupt the monstrosity, so it's not up to the tank to do so, since that'll be very luck-based whether they can actually get the monstrosity at that point. So here you can see, as I said, I'm just maintaining my energy stacks as much as I can, keeping it as close to full as possible, and then just swapping between the targets, interrupting myself first before I do strike, consume a pool, then I go back to the Amber Shaper, hit him, consume a pool, back to the monstrosity, interrupt myself, hit him, and so on. So here you can see I'm following the Amber Shaper since he's the next target, and pushed him far away. And you can see kind of what the stack count is like. You'll probably get around 40 stacks or so on Amber Shaper as you're entering the final phase, which is plenty. He will go down very fast. So you'll only have to deal with 1 or 2 of the globule casts during Phase 3 with this strategy. It's silly how fast Phase 3 is. And you can see that the cooldown for self Amber Explosion is pretty accurate. So if you have a cooldown from a boss mod or weak auras or something, that's pretty reliable. And again, I've got this huge warning with sounds and everything, just so I absolutely know when that's casting and I can interrupt myself quickly. So there, the monstrosity probably would have died before Destabilize ran out. It had about 2 seconds left, but I was worried, so I recast it again anyway. But I probably should have held off and just used that other Amber Strike on the boss, Amber Shaper, instead. Now, once you get into the final phase, you should have at least 1 pool saved up, or 1 living Amber. Ideally more than that, but at least 1 is good. And you can see I wait until I'm at 50 or below to consume a pool in the final phase. And this is because on Heroic, Amber pools give you 50 energy during Phase 3 rather than 20 throughout the rest of the fight. So you can kind of extend your lifespan a lot more by using those. There you see the respawn happened just as I was going out to consume, so I'm going to die pretty soon here, but so is the boss. So there you go. That's a tank guide for construct management for Heroic Amber Shaper Unsock. Good luck, and thanks for watching.